Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's Ask Me Anything session on creating your cap table. My name is Christina Wood. I'm the Director of Programs here at Communitech, and I'm so excited to have you all join us today. Before we kick things off, I just wanted to review a couple of housekeeping items. So just as a reminder, today's session is being recorded. All of our past AMA sessions can be found on our website at communitech.ca, and we use those as a resource for companies to refer back to. We also ask that you please keep your microphone on mute and use the chat feature to ask any of your questions. Today is really geared towards a conversation, so please do put any questions that you have into chat and our speakers will be happy to answer them. Today's session is also meant to provide general guidance. So if you do have any specific questions that aren't answered today, we will provide an opportunity for you to connect one-on-one with our presenters. So you can reach out to your Communitech CSM or advisor and they will get you connected. If you don't have a CSM or advisor, or you're not yet a Communitech member, you can reach out to me, christina.wood@communitech.ca, and I'm happy to get you connected. Here's a look at some of our upcoming Ask Me Anything sessions. So next week we have one on market diversification and growth in uncertain times. And the following week, getting started in the wild world of digital marketing. So 2 exciting sessions coming up. And with that, I will turn things over to my colleague, Amber French, who's Communitech's Director of Strategic Capital, and she will be moderating today's session with our 2 participants. Amber, I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So as Christina mentioned, I'm the Director of Strategic Capital. I actually recognize a bunch of names in the participants, so thanks for coming out today and spending some time with us. This is a topic I was really excited about. I get a lot of questions about cap table considerations, especially from earlier founders. And there's a lot that you can do to mitigate some mistakes down the line if you know things in advance. So I am so happy to welcome Sean Gomes. So I'll turn it over to Sean actually to introduce himself and Francesca as well. So Sean, go ahead.
Thanks, Amber. Yeah, so I'm Sean Gomes. I'm a partner with Gowling, which is a law firm in a national law firm with an office in Kitchener-Waterloo. My practice focuses primarily on entrepreneurs and startup companies, assisting with all areas of their legal needs, but primarily I help companies with incorporations, fundraising, equity issuances, and then on sale and M&A transactions. And happy to be participating today.
I'm passing it along to Francesca.
Thanks so much, Amber and Christina, for having me today. So nice to meet everybody. My name is Francesca Puccinelli, and I'm with Carta. And for folks that might not be familiar with Carta, Carta is a cap table management software that helps companies really from their incorporation all the way to a potential exit, either whether that be an IPO or an M&A transaction. So we are here to really help you tell your investable story through your cap table. And a little bit of my background: I've been with Carta for about 4 years now. So started actually during our Series B. So I've seen the company grow from 200 employees up until over 1,000. So like many of you on the line who might be even on the earlier side of things, I've definitely seen the high growth that Carta has had. So happy to chat a little bit about cap tables, happy to chat a little bit about your journey. So looking forward to this conversation.
And this is really meant to be like pretty loosely based. We have some questions that I'm going to be asking Francesca and Sean, but if you guys have any questions specifically that you wanted to ask, just feel free to throw them up in the chat and then I'll address them towards the end. So we'll get started. This is a lot to cover on this topic today, but I guess I'll start with you, Sean. So, I mean, when a startup begins to think about the roadmap for their cap table, what are some of the very first considerations that they should be thinking about in order to position themselves for their best success?
Yeah, typically when I'm meeting with clients for the first time, whether I had sort of help with their incorporation or not, one of the first items I'm looking at are their articles of incorporation for the company. And again, this applies whether they're unincorporated or if they've already sort of started that process. And really what we want to look at there is the current share terms that the company has authorized. And that's important because as you really grow the company and your cap table starts to evolve, you want to ensure that you've got sort of flexibility within the starting set of share terms. So really what I want to see is a simple a set of share terms. Typically it involves just common shares, and then some variation, whether we're using both sort of voting and non-voting common shares. And I think we'll talk a little bit more in the discussion here about the use of equity incentives for advisors and employees. And when I'm having these early discussions with clients, we're talking about whether or not they want those types of equity holders to hold voting or non-voting shares. So that's part of the discussion and some of the early things we're thinking about. Also want to make sure that the articles and the company's position to utilize available exemptions under securities laws. So anytime a company is going to look to raise money, there's a requirement to comply with applicable securities laws in the jurisdiction in which they're issuing shares. And so in Ontario, for example, there are a few requirements to utilize things like the accredited investor exemption and other exemptions that need to be present in their articles of incorporation. So that's sort of some of the things I look at in the articles. The other sort of big one, and you might not sort of necessarily associate with a cap table, is a shareholders agreement. So for those of you who don't know, shareholders agreement effectively is an agreement amongst the different shareholders, governs how the shareholders are going to interact with each other. But for cap table purposes, it speaks to how shares can be transferred either among shareholders or to third parties, and it really restricts that process. And so it's important to have an agreement like that in place so that, again, you're able to manage who is on your cap table and what happens if someone wants to sort of exit from the company. So those are really two early considerations.
Francesca, I'm going to turn over to you. So keeping on the early track, founders are setting it up their corporation. How should they think about founder equity splits? Is 50-50 a good idea, bad idea? I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of what Carta is seeing just on our end, and for context for folks, Carta has over 20,000 companies using our platform. So we see companies from very early stage and can kind of base a lot of our commentary from the data that we see. So in terms of the data, I would say a 50-50 split between two founders is definitely common, but there are some things that you should consider as you are developing your company, and maybe you're thinking about either bringing on a co-founder, or you might be starting the company with another person. And I think it's definitely important to consider things, because just when the data says something, it doesn't always mean that you should follow that for your specific company. So a couple of things to consider with regards to the co-founder split. One important thing is the role. So sometimes with the co-founder split, the CEO might get more equity than potentially a COO or a CTO. And this is just because this might be that person who came together with the idea. They might be bringing on the secondary person to kind of help run the show and kind of help them out with specific functions. So we do see that, or rather you should consider that the CEO might get more equity than just the somebody else that's coming on board. And another thing to keep in mind as you're going through this process is what prior accomplishments has either co-founder done within their career. Maybe they have created a company prior, or maybe they're a serial founder or serial entrepreneur that will have an easier time getting fundraising than you might have had by yourself. So that's another thing to think about as you're bringing on somebody else. One other thing that I think is very common is the timing of the co-founder. Maybe somebody came in, established the company, and then a few months down the line, they're adding in a secondary co-founder. That is another thing to keep in mind and another thing to work towards. Last couple of things, skills of co-founders. Maybe you're a business person and you need a technical co-founder to kind of help you run the code or to create the product. I think that's something to think about. Hey, maybe I wouldn't be able to build my company without that person. And maybe in that consideration, a 50-50 split might make sense. The final couple things, IP. This is something that's really important to establish early on, is to kind of outline what IP you have as a company. This especially becomes important not only with technology, but if you are working on a biotech or life science companies, this is definitely a huge consideration to think about. The final thing I have for you all is just a workload balance. I think, you know, many of us have gone through the whole group project phenomenon where, you know, one person does a lot more than the other person, but you still end up with the same grade. So you want to make sure that there is a balance there and that your co-founder is taking on the same level of work as you might be as a founder or as somebody who's in this co-founder relationship. So I think definitely a lot of things to consider as you're going through this process, but we are still seeing a lot of that 50-50 split happen. But definitely keep an open mind as you're going through this process and be able to explain why what you decided makes sense for your company.
Sean, any other considerations for founder shares?
Yeah, I think the other sort of consideration from a legal perspective that I run into quite a bit is sort of thinking about whether or not these founder shares should be issued on sort of a restricted or a reverse vesting basis. And people might be familiar with this concept, and it's fairly, I would say, typical these days, given the fact that when you're issuing founder shares or early stage employee shares, that those shares are being issued on sort of an understanding that the person is going to be contributing to the company over a period of time. And so it's become sort of regular or common practice to issue those shares on basically a reverse vesting basis. So the individual gets all of the shares, but those shares remain subject to a right for the company to buy them back if the individual sort of leaves or is no longer part of the company. And it's important because, again, I've had sort of clients who, you know, weren't, didn't come to me first in issuing their founder shares, and had scenarios where, you know, people contributed for a 3-month period and then someone left, and they were surprised to kind of find that, you know, all of the 2 founders, or if there were 4 founders, that everyone was still going to have the same number of shares, notwithstanding the fact that that person left, which obviously is kind of unfair and never would have been the intention of the parties had they put their minds to it. So it's important, again, when you're issuing founder shares, and even after you've issued founder shares, because this topic will come up sometimes with investors if they don't see a restricted or reverse vesting process in place, to ensure that people are incentivized, and that if, you know, and a common vesting period, again, is maybe 3 or 4 years with cliffs and monthly or quarterly vesting. So that's a big one anytime you're going to issue shares that are based on someone's ongoing contribution. I think the other part, not exactly related to your cap table, but the other part to really, that goes kind of hand in hand with founder share issuance is around intellectual property and the transfer of intellectual property when someone gets their shares. So whenever you're thinking about, again, we're going to issue shares to someone who's contributing to this project, you want to ensure at the same time you're thinking about or having that person sign an IP assignment document effectively in consideration of the shares they receive. So again, those things go hand in hand.
So we've covered off founders, but a lot of early stage companies also end up bringing on advisors or someone onto their board that they want to grant equity to as well. Francesca, what are you seeing as far as that goes?
Yeah, so this is something that I get a lot of questions on. So just to kind of level set here, I think a lot of early stage founders want to bring on somebody to kind of help them out, but they might not want to bring them on as a full-time hire, or they might bring on somebody more strategically to really assist with either the creation of their product or to kind of help them run their business. So I would say there's 2 models that we see happening here. The first of which being, and this happens quite a bit, perhaps you're bringing on an advisor and there might be an opportunity for that advisor to invest. So with that, you're not necessarily giving them equity within your company, and you're also getting an investment and creating this strategic advisor for yourself. So if folks on the line are thinking about bringing on an advisor, that might be a conversation. If they know your business well and they believe in your business, there might be an opportunity for them to invest a small check, or there might be an opportunity for them to really think about even investing long-term within your company. So definitely, I think many advisors are expecting that conversation. So don't be afraid to ask that conversation or ask for that investment potentially. And then the second thing that we're seeing a lot of is for advisors to either be granted restricted stock, sort of similarly to how Sean was talking about that co-founder agreement. You're going to want to ensure that restricted stock, basically it's sort of shares with a vesting schedule to ensure that those advisors are incentivized to stay with you for a certain period of time. Or if you have an option pool developed, oftentimes these advisors might be getting options as well. So definitely both things to consider within this workflow. And I think in terms of numbers, we do have some data from Carta to just help you at least benchmark what some advisors might be expecting in terms of the equity percentage, but definitely something to consider that advisors might have their own agreement in place. So if this is something that they're doing quite often, they might be the ones to dictate how much equity that they would like to get. And this is just something for you to balance with them to understand, hey, does this person's value equate to the amount of equity that I might be giving them? And being able to balance that is definitely important. And I'll throw in this article from Carta just so folks can have an idea about what we're seeing in the market. And there's also some helpful tips in there, similar to what I just discussed.
Awesome, thank you. So, I mean, as far as employees go, how early do companies or should companies start looking at creating that option plan, and how much should they allocate for it?
Yeah, I think this is another important question. I think depending on, what your law firm might say, or Sean probably advises many of his clients on this, but we're seeing companies establish an equity plan pretty early on, especially if they're hiring employees. So what I would say is, depending on kind of how employees are going to be hired on, it's a good idea as you're making those first hires to create an equity plan for them, just so that you can have that set in place and also have a specific amount of shares set aside for them. So you'll hear oftentimes within many conversations, whether that be in advisors or talks like this, oftentimes folks will mention an equity plan. And what that is, it is a specific pool of shares that's set aside for oftentimes employees, consultants, advisors, and that is specifically used to grant out shares to those folks. So this way, as you're thinking about bringing on outside capital, as you're thinking about bringing on other types of investments, whether that be a SAFE or a note, you know that you have this pool of shares reserved just for employees. And so that's something that we see quite often, that folks are establishing that pretty early on. And I would say for an early stage company, maybe up until Series B, we're seeing about a 10 to 15% allocation for that plan. So again, this is pulling from the data on Carta, just because it's kind of what everybody's doing doesn't necessarily mean that you should apply that to your company, but just for you to get a little bit of benchmarking ideas, that's what we're seeing on the Carta platform.
Sean, in some of the pieces that you're pulling together, are you seeing that 10 to 15% is fairly typical as well?
Exactly. Yeah. The nice part, to some of Francesca's points there. So yeah, it's something typically we're doing early on. Like, it's not an item putting in place your option plan isn't something you need to do out of the gate before you've hired employees or are planning on actually issuing any options to anyone. It's something you can wait, and then when you're going to hire someone, you can put it in place then. yeah, definitely 10 to 15% is the norm. And like on the legal side, again, the plans themselves and the types of vesting and the terms, I would say, are fairly typical, like fairly standardized. And so, at least like in my own practice, it's an easy deliverable on my end to a client. Like it's something we do, for example, on a fixed fee basis, and it's like relatively inexpensive. You know, and there's very little variation. It's like from my end, it's a limited discussion with like my client about, hey, what does this mean? And again, typically it's something that's pretty easy to get accomplished and quickly as well.
And Sean, so I mean, when you're issuing equity at early stages for advisors and employees, should you be issuing them as shares or as options? What do you think your preference
Yeah. So I would say just maybe the starting response there would be from the company's perspective, it's almost always going to be best to issue options, and that's probably the more typical route for both advisors and employees. And that's for a combination of reasons. The primary reason being, as an option holder, I have less rights than I do as a shareholder. So being a shareholder, I automatically am entitled to certain rights in respect to the company at law, and I don't have those rights as an option holder. And so if I never achieve the milestones to actually vest my options or to sort of reverse vest my shares, then sort of no harm done. I'm no longer with the company. My options expire. I don't have to deal with the fact that this person is or was a shareholder. So that's kind of the more common route. But there are instances, both I would say like with advisors who are going to play, let's say, a key role, and let's say an advisor is pushing for shares instead of options, which they might have reason to do. And then for those sort of, I don't know, sometimes they're sort of the quasi founders, like they're key hires early on, that are maybe not part of the company at incorporation or at the initial stages, but are get engaged 2, 3, 4 months in and fill a key role. Those types of people I often see receiving shares instead of options, because again, it's sort of like a conceptual, hey, we're going to treat this person like a founder. And in those scenarios, again, it's just something you want to be sure you do right. You've got sort of, again, this reverse vesting concept. So yeah, it's really, again, it's fact by fact, and it's discussions I have with clients quite often. But I would say typically it's options as you progress.
Okay, so we're just going to switch tracks and ask the tough question. So what are some of the most common mistakes that you guys are seeing? I'm going to go to you, Francesca, but I'm going to hit you up after Sean as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of what we just discussed kind of compounds into what we really see as very common mistakes that happen with founders. I think one thing for sure is not having a proper record of the equity. So this is kind of where your cap table comes into play. And I think, of course, I'm a bit biased myself, but having a software in place really helps you can keep track of how much equity that you're granting out. So that way you have this one source of truth where you are able to show with your law firm, you're able to show with any advisors that you're working with, or even investors, where your equity stands. And also to note that you're not missing any pieces, because I think something that I've seen just with a lot of the founders that I've worked with, or even a lot of the horror stories that I've seen, is that if you're missing one bit of equity, or if you're missing a safe the night before a financing round, that can derail your entire deal. And I think from the founder standpoint, you don't want to ever have to be in this position where something can get derailed that quickly. So definitely think that it's a really advisable choice to ensure that your equity is in a really clean place. And then the second part of that is being able to ensure that your employees, as well as advisors, know where they stand within the company. I think that's something that we see quite often, where somebody might promise somebody grants and then it never materializes to anything. And that can create a lot of confusion or mistrust and take away the time from building the company to focus on these minor issues that could be solved early on. So I think those are really some very common mistakes that we see. And then the second thing that I often see is sort of switching gears is not knowing kind of what your dilution might have if you're raising something like a safe or a convertible note. So these particular vehicles don't necessarily have a immediate dilution effect on your cap table, but anytime that you might be raising a price round where those types of vehicles might convert into shares, that can cause dilution for you as a founder or with your co-founders, can cause dilution there. So you always want to keep a handle on what those safes or notes might mean down the line, and really keep in mind the modeling factor of understanding, hey, this is what my safe terms are. Here's what I'm thinking about raising. And you can kind of work backwards to understand what your dilution might be, or even think about the different terms that you might put in place for your safes and notes so that you end up in a place where you want to be down the line.
Thank you. And Sean, what do you think?
Yeah, I'd say, on my end, the sort of record keeping or memorializing, sorry, I think maybe school's about done. Memorializing the agreement or what you promised in terms of equity is probably the most frequent mistake that I see on my end. So, I have over the years had like a number of scenarios where clients have, said to someone along the way, hey, we'll give you, 5% or 3%, and the parties, the other party, there's a back and forth about how much the person is going to get and what their involvement might be. And for whatever reason, that relationship either sort of doesn't like really kind of materialize or move forward, or it does, and the company doesn't properly paper what was agreed upon. And so those can be like, company killers in some cases, or can be just really costly mistakes when, when you're down the road and an investor doing diligence and this comes to light, or there's some announcement about the company raising a ton of money and someone comes out of the woodwork to say, well, hey, I was promised shares and you never gave them to me and whatnot. So that really is a big one. And part of that as well, I think, is sort of speaking in terms of percentages. And I know it's hard not to do that because people want to know what percentage they have, but it's important at some stage to translate that into sort of a number of shares. Because again, I've had a few different situations in which someone was promised a percentage and they sort of turn that into something that was advantageous in the sense that they sort of took the position, I'm never diluted. So if you told me I was going to get 5%, and that meant I was always going to get 5%, even if there's subsequent issuances down the road, as you might expect, that dilutes, would dilute everyone, and that can have a big impact, and really again can make it for an unfortunate situation if that relationship sort of sours or becomes acrimonious. Some of the other things I think we talked about a little bit. An overly complex cap table, I think, is another sort of mistake or common a common thing that comes up that sort of results in some issues for the company. So, things like, I have clients who will say, oh, I want to issue this type of share that has some wacky features or some just sort of convoluted terms. And while it sort of might seem like that's a good idea, or you might think that's, helpful, I think down the road, those types of structures for like tech companies who are looking to do future raises and sort of progress along sort of a certain track in terms of, doing your Series C or doing SAFEs, your Series C, Series A, Series B. Those types of unusual or complex arrangements are never helpful. And again, that can be a real impediment on the fundraising side when an investor is looking at your cap table or your share terms and they see something that's just way off market. So I think that's ideally really something you want to avoid. Similar again to what sort of Francesca was saying, I quite often see the giving away too much of the pie early on. You have to, as a founder, you have to strike a balance between being generous and incentivizing people and really wanting to be fair to employees and your early stakeholders. But then at the same time, you don't want to wind up in a situation where, again, successive or subsequent fundraising results in sort of significant dilution to the founders because they were overly generous early on with people who didn't have a long-term sort of role in the company. And now, the 2 or 3 founders, after doing their Series A, when you sort of tack on the conversion of SAFEs or convertible debentures, their position becomes something that's in the 30 or 40 or 50, even the 50% range is kind of like that's lower than where you would ideally want to land. And so as you're sort of particularly doing these pre-seed or pre-Series A issuances, you really want to kind of be mindful of, again, as Francesca said, like what your cap table will sort of look into the future and see what your cap table might look like as you issue more shares. A small one that hopefully no one sort of in the meeting here is sort of has, but typically for clients of mine or when I see companies who maybe started out with either on their own, which is fine, or with a lawyer who wasn't familiar with tech companies, like I often see companies who have issued a really low number of shares. So they've issued 100 shares to the founders or 1,000 shares, which is fixable, but obviously, again, as you progress into issuing more and more shares, you want to issue 0.5% to someone by way of options. You don't want it to get into sort of like fractional or decimal shares. And so early on, I sort of make sure clients are, using a bigger denominator at the outset, just to avoid the need to have to go and fix that in the future. And it's not, again, it's something that is fixable, but perhaps, if this comes up as part of diligence from an investor who kind of really knows what they're doing, it probably doesn't reflect well on, hey, you thought about what's typical and what would be customary. So that's kind of another one that I, again, see from time to time that's easy to avoid.
Yeah, and I think both of you seem to hone in on the fact that just record keeping was incredibly important and keeping things clean, especially when you're moving into fundraising. So on that point, when you're looking at fundraising, a lot of early stage companies are raising through friends and family, or they're raising through angel investors, and the checks might be smaller than, obviously a Series A or later stage round. So how do you approach, Francesca, looking at smaller checks? Do you recommend turning them into an SPV, or are they fine on the cap table sitting as small investments?
Yeah, definitely. So again, I think depending on where your company is based also might have an impact on this. So I would say it definitely depends on your relationship with small checks. So oftentimes we're seeing, especially in like a friends and family round, as you mentioned, Amber, very small checks, maybe 10 or so family members are contributing 5,000 each, and that can add up very quickly on the cap table. And I think from the investor perspective, I think this perception might be changing a bit, but from the investor perspective, sometimes this can seem like a crowded cap table, and investors are going to want to know the rights of every single shareholder that is on the cap table prior to them making their investment. So in certain agreements that you might be making, there might be something called pro rata rights. And this is kind of what Sean might have mentioned a little bit before, where folks might think that they'll have 5% of the company in perpetuity, or they'll have the ability to do follow-on investments to maintain that ownership percentage. And sometimes that can be a a red flag for many investors. So they're going to want to know the details of the agreements. The second thing that Amber mentioned, that I would say this is also coming up quite a bit now, and I'm based in the US, so I do see quite a bit of equity crowdfunding raises that happen on various platforms. And there is a new regulation in the US that allows for a bigger raise on that matter. So again, this might be a different perspective, but oftentimes we are seeing companies that are raising through a friends and family round, but are combining all of those investments under an SPV. And for folks in the line that aren't familiar with an SPV is something that's called a special purpose vehicle, which in essence is sort of combining all of the investments in one line item on the cap table. And then you might have an outside provider that sort of manages all of the investors on the other end. So all of those potentially friends and family that might be investing, somebody else will be managing that. And then on the cap table, that comes in as one single line on the cap table. So I would say it really depends on your relationship with small checks and kind of the perception that the investors that you're thinking about raising from might have about multiple names on the cap table, but know that things will be scrutinized and the terms of those agreements will be scrutinized with any sort of follow-on raise that happens.
Sean, what about any legal considerations when accepting smaller investments?
Yeah, there's definitely a few to think about. I mean, I would say from my perspective, obviously, if you can get to, the raise amount that you're looking to achieve, if you can get there with fewer people, candidly, it's just better. But I appreciate, that's not always kind of the way it works. And then also, I know lots of clients who, want to be able to allow sort of participation, particularly on kind of the friends and family side, and that's sort of important to them. I would say there's a couple different elements. I mean, and again, Francesca touched, I think, a bit on the shareholder communication side, and then there's sort of the straight sort of securities and corporate law requirements. So on the communication side, I think the use of an SPV is potentially helps to mitigate some of those complications. But again, there's still going to be lots of circumstances, again, in a subsequent raise or a sale where you need to get shareholder approval, and having sort of that many people on the cap table is just a challenge from sort of a straight legal requirement perspective. So again, I spoke to it a little bit earlier. There's a few different exemptions, and again, this gets into sort of a technical, some legal points, but there are a few different exemptions that companies in Canada typically rely upon when you're issuing shares. And one of the most prevalent exemptions, called the private issuer exemption, is contingent on you having a certain number of shareholders, or less than a certain number of shareholders, less than 50. And that would look through an SPV as well. It's a number of sort of beneficial shareholders. So utilizing an SPV in that scenario doesn't help you in this particular instance. And so when you exceed that number, then you do have to weigh the implications of not having the availability of that exemption sort of going in the future. So that's one sort of specific legal consideration. The other one is there are on the corporate governance end, there are additional obligations, again, for companies that exceed that 50 shareholder mark, from a sort of a reporting and an annual meeting perspective. So, companies, small companies, like sort of under 50 for this purpose, have less obligations when it comes to how they conduct their shareholders meetings, what type of information they need to provide to companies and to shareholders. And when you're over that 50 mark, that sort of those reporting obligations and governance obligations become, again, slightly more onerous. So it's something just, again, to be mindful of when you're looking at your cap table and weighing kind of, okay, how many investors, do I take that extra 20K? Is it worth it or not? That sort of thing. And then maybe just the last point on that, these considerations though are outside of employees or former employees. So you're allowed to, or when you issue shares or options to employees and people who become former employees, those don't count in these sort of on the technical legal requirements. So again, something to be aware of. Obviously, that has an impact on the process you need to run from a shareholder communication process post issuance, even if you have, if you have 100 or 200 shareholders. Again, I have clients like those, and I've had M&A transactions where we worked that process. It just is quite a bit more more of a challenge.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then we've got some great questions up in the comments section, so I'll flip over there. But when raising a SAFE or note, how are you calculating, or how do founders calculate the dilution? Their dilution, anyways. Francesca?
Yeah, I can take this one. So I would say there are a couple different tools online and also a lot of different math formulas that you can do. So I would definitely recommend the tools online. I'll throw in the chat after I finish speaking a tool from Carta that you can utilize. But essentially what you'll need to consider when you're calculating the dilution for a SAFE or convertible note is you'll need to kind of have some inputs in place. So you'll need to know what your future round might look like. You'll need to know the existing shareholders on the platform, including your existing shareholders on the cap table, rather, including yourself. And you'll also need to know any sort of terms that are associated with different convertibles and safes. And some considerations to think about are, is this SAFE or note converting on a pre-money basis or a post-money basis? So that will also determine what the future outcome will look like. And essentially what you can do is you can kind of back into, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, you can kind of back into this number. If you haven't essentially raised anything yet, this will be a really helpful tool so that you ensure that you're getting the terms that you want to push out the numbers that you want to get. And another thing to also keep in mind is people like Sean or your attorneys will also be able to kind of help you think about this strategically and see what I would say more common terms are kind of happening within the market, just so you have an idea of, hey, I think this is the number that I'm trying to hit. This is my dilution that I want to get, and what can we balance out there to optimize for the best outcome. So I'll throw in a little calculator that we have available for you to take a look at right after this.
And I think this is so important. I've seen companies get so screwed over by raising multiple safes and not projecting what their actual dilution is going to be at conversion. Sean, have you seen that as well?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Yeah. It's one of the things I sort of try to drive home with founders like early on, the importance of maintaining that kind of visual, like sort of pro forma cap table, as Francesca mentioned as well, that you're actually doing that work, because people are super focused on raising money, which is important, obviously important, but it's sort of just, okay, now I'm on to the next safe and the next safe and the next safe, which is great, but you really sort of can quickly like lose track of what the implications are of sort of those safes. And then again, it's I've had clients who are like experienced entrepreneurs, and for whatever reason sort of weren't thinking about the implication of the safe, and then we went to do their Series seed round that resulted in the conversion of these instruments, and it was sort of like shocking as to where the dust settled on these things. So yeah, really important to again have that pro forma cap table running so that you can be dropping in what if type scenarios, and that also again really can help, like not only like not say you don't take the money on this on your safes, but it can really help to also, I think, like sharpen or hone what you're asking for on that conversion round. Like it's obviously it's about how much you're raising and the valuation, but you also want to like tie that into, okay, but where do we want the cap table to land, and what does that imply or mean from a valuation and a raise amount perspective? So yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to flip over into some of the questions here. So one from Ash says, are there any strategies that can be applied through the cap table to mitigate the hesitation regarding married founders? So for example, can a 90-10 split mitigate those concerns? Does that make sense?
Sorry, and what hesitation in what? And like, are we talking about?
Well, I think so, yeah, from an investor's perspective, a lot of investors might be hesitant about investing in America because they almost look at it as one co-founder as opposed to, and there's complications that can happen or whatnot. So it sounds like Ash is asking about if there's a split that can mitigate these concerns.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm assuming this is a scenario where where the married co-founders are both participating, where they're both involved in the company. There's a sort of a rationale for the ownership split. Is that? I'm assuming that's.
And I mean, that's how I would interpret it. But
yeah.
Ash, if you want to hop on and clarify, please feel free to do so. But otherwise, yeah, Sean, go ahead and answer the question.
Yeah, I mean, I've had lots of clients. I would say particularly over the last several years, where coming out of, let's say, like, the winding down of BlackBerry over the last couple of years, I've had, like, as a result of that, I've actually had quite a few clients come out who were spouses and decided, okay, we're going to now do this together after coming out of somewhere else. Usually the concern that I see around that is not so much about the share split. It's almost more about the breakdown of that relationship and what impact that has on the company from a business perspective. So I guess, sort of to answer the question, I would say having a majority of the shares owned by one of the spouse is probably going to be helpful, because then it means even if there was a breakdown in that relationship, there's going to continue to be this consistency. But I don't know that it avoids what at least from my experience, what the larger concern is that you have to satisfy an investor on is, can the spouses, work together and this sort of maybe concern that there's a risk that it might be an issue in the future, wherever the company goes. Not sure if that answered the question.
So further to that point, she can't unmute. So I apologize about that. Right. I forgot about that function. But yeah, so her point was 50-50 splits give investors pause. So it sounds like you can mitigate a little bit of that by doing a varied split, to your point.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, next question. So this is about the procedures about the option. So the question is, can the option agreement be separate from the advisor employment agreement, or should it be part of those agreements?
Yeah, ideally. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
No, go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, I was going to say, at least for me, typically and ideally they're sort of separate. So as Francesca was talking about before, like, you establish your stock option plan, and that sets out like all of kind of the details on how your options work. And then you issue option agreements under that plan, which specifies, the name of the person, how many options they're getting, what their vesting terms are, what their exercise price is. And those are separate from the individual employment agreement or the advisor agreement. And so normally the employment agreement or the advisor agreement would, again, set out the terms of their engagement, like what they're going to do, when does the agreement end, if they're getting paid anything from an advisor perspective, what does that mean? And then it will, in the compensation provision, say, okay, and you will be in, what it should say is, and you will be entitled to, receive options in this amount pursuant to our option plan. And then you sort of have your option agreement. That's part of that agreement. So again, ideally, from my perspective, you don't want to be trying to build all of the things you want to capture in an option agreement or an option plan into your employment agreement or your advisor agreement. They're typically or should be separate.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Sean, I think one common misconception that I see a lot of is kind of this employment agreement or advisor agreement might not be necessarily the exact same as that option agreement. So in other words, your offer letter doesn't necessarily grant somebody shares outright. So that's another thing to keep in mind and to consider, that regardless of kind of what is said in an offer letter or an offer agreement, that's something that you still need to take this one step further and make sure to issue out an option agreement or a shares agreement, whatever sort of that engagement sort of looks like, in order to actually officially grant those shares out.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point, because I've had clients who thought that was the end of it, and then back to our earlier points about sort of common mistakes is, again, that sort of those terms haven't been fully evolved, and it can sort of create issues in the future when you haven't sort of taken that next step. So yeah, that's a good point.
Next question is, my co-founder and I just agreed to a 70-30 split based on effort put into the company. We also thought that dilution would occur along the same lines, 70-30. Is this common? Is this too complicated?
Yeah, and Francesca, if you want me to tackle that one first, or if you want to.
Yeah, I can just jump in with a couple of thoughts, and then maybe Sean, you can give more of the legal rationale there. I would say that it really depends on kind of what 70-30 means, because I think down the line, like as dilution happens, like yes, if you plan to maintain that same share structure, and you don't plan to kind of grant additional equity to you and your co-founders down the line, then yes, in theory, those two co-founder splits would remain the same. But you also have to consider, hey, maybe there's an opportunity for us to get equity. Maybe one co-founder is performing more at that point in time, and that's a conversation that you would down the line have with your board, and they would be able to kind of be that final governing party to say, hey, I think we also should grant more equity to this one person or this person. So I think that it will really depend on what happens with your company down the line, but I wouldn't necessarily say that 70-30 split might be true for the life of your company.
Yeah, and I would say, like, for me, I'm definitely I'm not a fan of, I mean, it's doable, but I'm not a fan of trying to sort of like manipulate or artificially create dilution in sort of like a specific, or I don't want to say contrived because that sounds wrong, but like in a specific way. I think those types of scenarios usually just, no matter how sort of good intentions, they from my perspective, they often don't, they're sort of more trouble than they're worth. Usually the way I kind of want to see these arrangements is, again, thinking about it, like the new issuances come from, again, treasuries. So you're increasing your denominator on your number of shares, right? You're not taking shares from people that have already been issued. You're increasing out of treasury. So it's adding to the denominator, and the resulting dilution should just sort of occur, again, like naturally or whatever. Like it should just happen. It should just be a function of, okay, if I have 100 shares now and we're 70-30 and I go and issue 20 new shares to someone else, again, the pro rata dilution just occurs as a function of, okay, well, now it's 70 divided by 120. I think this question's asking about, well, hey, can I find ways to kind of apply it differently? And if that's the case, I would say, like, again, those are scenarios I like to try and stay away from where I can. It's not that I haven't done them, but I generally try and like to stay away from those types of, manufactured dilution scenarios.
We have just a couple of minutes left. Let's get through a couple more questions as fast as we can, if we can. But so next question is, how would you advise a company on raising capital or developing operations in relation to potentially losing CCPC status and the impact of this?
Yeah. That's a really good question. And I don't know, whoever asked that, I should have probably added that question to our presentation, because it's a good question. Obviously, like for those who don't know, in Canada, if you're a Canadian controlled private corporation at CCPC, there's some considerable tax advantages when you're incurring research and development costs just on your tax for corporate tax purposes. And then the big one is, if you're a CCPC, when you sell the shares of a CCPC, your first I think it's 900K or so, or some meaningful amount is sort of tax free. And again, so I'll try and answer this one quickly, but putting that specific question aside, that is something that you should be mindful of every time you go and raise money, to ensure that you are tracking who is Canadian, who is not Canadian, and to the extent you can, that you're preserving your Canadian control. And the CCPC test is basically defined around, that sort of non-Canadians don't own more than 50%. It's the sort of, you can have 50-50, but if non-Canadians own more than 50%, you lose this status, which can have some big implications. And so as you're fundraising, again, you have to weigh this with, where am I getting my money? Because typically, your later rounds are going to come from the US. And so, it can be hard to avoid, but you want to bear in mind, where am I landing on this in this process, and how can I help to preserve CCPC status? On the question, again, I think job number one is keeping this kind of in your mind so you can manage it. There are some approaches that you can take that are potentially subject to challenge by CRA, where again, you're creating a class of sort of super voting shares that you give to Canadians that have no economic value. So there are different ways, and this gets into more of a tax question and would be good sort of for accountants, but there are some ways to try and help preserve where you inevitably are raising more in the US. But again, it's those types of scenarios can create complexity, and you have to weigh, is it worth it and is it not? But again, it's a good point to keep in mind as you fundraise and as you're managing your cap table.
Perfect. No, thank you. And so I think we can answer one more very quickly. Any guidance on standard discounts on convertible notes? Fast answer. What are you seeing?
Yeah, I can jump in. I think from my perspective, I like to stay away from giving hard and fast rules about kind of what a standard discount would be. So I would say it really will depend on kind of the investor that you're working with and the terms that they might expect with regard to that convertible note. So I know that isn't a great answer, Sean. I'm not sure if you have seen anything more standardized in your practice that you can jump in on.
I'd probably say 10, 10 to 15, 10 being kind of the low. It usually doesn't go below 10, and that would be favorable for the company. And then 20, I would, if I get a 20, I'm sort of saying, oh, well, that's unfortunate. Can we not sort of push back at 15? So I'd say somewhere between the 10 to 20 mark is kind of typical.
Awesome. Well, I apologize, we didn't get through all of the questions here, but absolutely, you can connect with Francesca or Sean offline. You can connect with me, and I can put you in touch with them as well to ask those questions. Thank you, everybody, for coming out today. I think it was a great conversation. I hate that we ran out of time because there are some good questions in the chat, but really appreciate having everyone come out and hear about cap tables, and hopefully it was beneficial to everybody. And it's recorded, so again, if it's something that you wanted to go back and refer to, it's something that'll be available in the AMA archives on the Communitech website. But thanks so much, Francesca and Sean, for coming and speaking today, and look forward to seeing you soon.
Yep, thanks for having us. Have a good one.
Everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, bye now.
Bye.